Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Putri Zhafira Zahra and this is my ID. In this video, I want to complete my midterm project from the Applied Linguistic course. So please pay attention. The development of Applied Linguistics. There is the table of content. So there are three materials that we're gonna talk in this presentation. First is the definition of applied linguistics. The second is the development of applied linguistics. And the third is the development of applied linguistics according to grade 2002. First is the definition of applied linguistics. Applied linguistics, using what we know about language, how it is learned, and how it is used in order to achieve some purpose or solve some problem in the real world. From Smith and Silti Murcia in 2002. So, and those proposed are many varied as evident in a definition given by Wilson. In a broad sense, applied linguistics is concerned with increasing understanding of the role of language in human affairs, and thereby with providing the knowledge necessary for those who are responsible for taking language-related decisions, whether the need of these arises in the classroom, the workplace, and the law court, or the laboratory. So applied linguistics does not lend itself to an easy definition, perhaps because, as Vivian Copley remarks, applied linguistics means many things to many people. So this absence of certain is much bemoaned by those who practice applied linguistics, but the lack of consensus can be found in other academic enterprises, especially those in the humanities and social sciences, where fragmentation is rifer, sometimes acting as an escape from disagreement and entrenched epistemological disputes as to the nature of the enterprise. Applied linguistics, a cover term for a sizable group of semi-autonomous disciplines, each defining its parentage and alliance between the formal study of language and other relevant fields, and each working to develop its own methodologies and principles. So, what is important is that applied linguistics is protected from the sneer that because language is everywhere, applied linguistics is the science of everything. In the 32 contribution to the Handbook of Applied Linguistics, we attempted to provide a wide coverage, ranging from an interest largely in language itself to a concern for interventions in institutional language use. The second is the development of applied linguistics. Early history. So, interest in language and language teaching has a long story, and we can trace his back at least as far as the ancient Greek, where both Plato and Aristotle contribute to the design of curriculum beginning with a good writing, then moving on to the effective discourse and culminating in the development of dialect to promote a philosophical approach to life. If we focus on English major attempts at linguistics, this work began to occur in the second half of the 18th century. In 1755, Samuel Johnson published his Dictionary of the English Language, which quickly became the unquestioned authority on the meanings of English words, It also had the effect of standardizing English spelling, which until the time had been relatively variable. So Robert Lloyd published an influential grammar book, Short Introduction to English Grammar, but whereas Johnson sought to describe English vocabulary by collecting thousands of examples of how English words were actually used, Lloyd prescribed what correct grammar should be. So he had no specialized linguistic background to do this, and unfortunately based his English grammar on the classical Latin model. Even though the two languages are organized in quite different ways, the result was that English, which is a Germanic language, was described by a linguistic system which was borrowed from Latin, which had previously borrowed the system from Greek. The process of prescribing rather than describing has left us with English grammar rules which are much too rigid to describe actual language usage. Applied linguistics during the 20th century. At the beginning of century, second language were usually taught by the grammar translation method, which has been in use since the late 18th century, but was fully codified in the 19th century by hard flows. A lesson would typically have one or two new grammar rules, a list of vocabulary, and items, and some practice example to translate from L1 to L2, or mean language 1 into language 2, or vice versa. So the approach was originally reforming in nature, attempting to make language learning easier through the use of example sentences instead of whole text. However, the method grew into a very controlled system, with a heavy emphasis on accurate and explicit grammar rules, many of which were quite obscure. By the beginning of the 20th century, new use-based ideas has coalesced into what became known as the direct method. This emphasizes exposure to oral language with listening and speaking as the primary skill. Meaning was related directly to the target language, without the step of translation, while explicit grammar teaching was also downplayed. It imitated how a mother tongue is learned naturally, with listening first, then speaking, and only later reading and writing. So the focus was squarely on use the second language, with stronger proponents banishing all use of the language one in the classroom. So the direct method has its own problems. However, it required teachers to be highly proficient in the target language, which was not always possible. Also, it mimicked language one learning but did not take into account the differences between language 1 and language 2 acquisition. One key difference is that language 1 learners have abundant exposure to the target language, which the direct method could not hope to match. So, in the UK, Michel West was interested in increasing learners' exposure to language through reading. His reading method attempted to make this possible by promoting reading skills through vocabulary management. To improve the readability of his textbook, he substituted low-frequency literary words such as usual, now, and area with more frequent items such as Iceland, nothing, and before. He also controlled the number of new words which could appear in any text. So, the three-method grammar translation, the direct method, and the reading method continue to hold sway until World War II. During the war, the weaknesses of all of the above approaches become obvious, as the American military found itself short of people who were conversationally fluent in foreign language. It needed a way of training soldiers in oral and oral skill quickly. American structural linguistics stepped into the gap and developed a program which borrowed from the direct method, especially its emphasis on listening and speaking. Chomsky's attack on the behaviorist underpinnings of structural linguistics in the late 1950s proved decisive, and its associated pedagogical approach, audiolinguism, began to fall out of favor. So, supplanting the behaviorist idea of habit formation, language was now seen as governed by cognitive factors, in particular a set of abstract rules which were assumed to be innate. So Chomsky suggests that children form hypotheses about their language that they test out in the practice. Some would naturally be incorrect, but Chomsky and his followers argue that children do not receive enough negative feedback from other people about this inappropriate language to be able to discard them. Chomsky posited that children are born with an understanding of the way language works, which was referred to as an universal grammar. They would know the underlying principle of language and their parameters. Those children would need only enough exposure to a language to determine whether their language one allowed the deletion of pronouns or not. This parameter setting would require much less exposure than a habit formation route, and so appeared a more convincing argument for how children learn language so quickly. The flurry of research inspired by Chomsky's ideas did much to stimulate the development of the field of the second language acquisition and its philosophical counterpart and physicolinguistics. In early 1970s, Hymas added the concept of communicative competence, which emphasized that language competence consists of more than just being able to form grammatically correct sentences, but also to know when and where to use these sentences and to whom. Next is the third, the development of applied linguistics according to Greg 2002. The term applied linguistics, which refers to the application of linguistics to the study and improvement of language teaching, language learning, language planning, management of language defect, communication between groups, lexicography, translation, etc., owes its origin to U.S. language teaching program during and after the Second World War. According to Grade 2002, it was largely based on the Leonard Bloomfield Outline Guide for the Practical Study of Foreign Language in 1942, which was said to be influenced by the early European advocates of the direct method, in particular Henry Swift. The history of applied linguistics can be discussed in different countries as noted by Grade 2002. In America, in 1948, a conference was organized by Charles C. Price, supported among others by Kenneth L. Pike and W. Freeman Twaddell at the University of Michigan to disseminate information about work at Price English Language Institute. It's founded in 1941. At that conference, a quarterly journal of applied linguistics, the title is Language Learning, was started. In Britain as well, a school of applied linguistics was established by G.C. Catford at the University of Edinburgh in 1956, and the Center of Applied Linguistics was set up in Washington, D.C. under Charles Ferguson in 1959. Greg note that National Association of Applied Linguistics came together in 1964 to form the Association Internationale de la Linguistique Applied, or AELA. This association holds a 4-yearly international congress with published proceedings. So Davis and Elder in 2006 commented on the symposium held at the American Association of Applied Linguistics, or AAAL, in St. Louis in the year 2001, where the history of applied linguistics was considered in 4 different countries. Angeles in 2001, discussing the USA proposed a 4-fold division of the history since the 1920s. The history was summarized thus. First, applied linguistics in North America does have identifiable root in linguistics. Second, while North American applied linguistics has evolved over time in its orientation and scope, so has North American linguistics. Third, a significant amount of work directed to the real-world issues involving language can be attributed to leading North American linguistics. Much of what can now be seen as a groundbreaking applied linguistic type activity was carried out prior to the formal appearance of applied linguistics. There was a gradual move away from the central focus on linguistics. Angeles notes that until the 1990s, there were a lot of language activity without much reference to linguistics. It was much later that scholars saw the need to link all these language activities to linguistics in the terms of their applications. In Australia, McNamara in 2001 points to a different tradition for Australian applied linguistics in contrast to the ones for UK and US. To McNamara, Australian applied linguistics made applied linguistics of modern language its target of immigrants rather than English. The application of linguistics to the development of teaching material and writing system of Aboriginal languages was also focused on. The Australia tradition of applied linguistics show a strong influence of continental Europe and of USA rather than of Britain. English came in the context of mother tongue teaching and teaching of English to immigrants, English as a second language. The English as a foreign language, British tradition got to in Australia in the 1980s. Scholars have noted that the important thing about applied linguistics in Australia it is concern for language in education, both with regard to new migrant language and literacy in English. So the British Association of Applied Linguistics, or BAAL, was formally established in 1967 with the aim of advancing education, fostering and promoting by any lawful, charitable means the study of the language use, language acquisition, and language teaching, and the fostering of interdisciplinary collaboration in the study BAAL in 1994. So Davis in 2001 notes that the British tradition represented a deliberate attempt to establish a distinctive applied linguistics. Davis in 2001 notes that it was taken for granted in the 1960s 1960s and 70s that applied linguistics was about language teaching. Over the last 30 years, it became clear that those studying English language teaching had already studied aspects of linguistics. So, Lewis, in 2001, notes that applied linguistics is trying to resolve language-based problems that people encounter in the real world. To Davis and Eldern in 2006, applied linguistics has grown quickly and it is flourishing with academic position, academic department, international journal, and an international association. Davis and Elder in 2006 comment on Windowson's distinction between linguistic applied or LA and applied linguistic AL. Thus, the differences between these modes of interpretation is that in the case of linguistic applied, and the assumption in that the problem can be reformulated by the direct and unilateral application of concepts and terms deriving from linguistic inquiry itself. So that is so to say, language problems are amenable to linguistic solution. In this case of applied linguistic, intervention of crucially a matter of mediation. Applied linguistics has to relate and reconcile different repetition of reality, including that of linguistics, without excluding others. Scholars such as Bloomfield in 1933 and Robbins thought that if a teacher understands the use of linguistics as a scientific method in language presentation, his or her work will be easy. So Davis and Eldred in 2006 believe that applied linguistics looks outwards beyond language in an attempt to explain and solve social problems, while linguistic applied looks inward not to solve language problems in the real world, but to explicit that and this and test theories about language itself. To them, this means that linguistic applied use language data to develop our linguistic knowledge about language, while applied linguistic studies as a language problem with the intention of correcting them. So this is the bibliography, and that's all from me. Thank you for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.